Next week, a concert from the Montreal Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Charles Dutoit, paying its first visit to Belfast. The concert includes Belfast's own Barry Douglas as the soloist in the Brahms Piano Concerto No. 1, and in the second half, a performance of Bartók's Concerto for Orchestra. The Montreal Symphony Orchestra at 7:30 next Saturday evening, and also in stereo on Radio 3. On BBC One now, the news and sport will be followed by another police story with Cagney and Lacey. And here on 2 in a moment, we set out on the Trireme quest. Tomorrow, the natural world looks at the Okavango, jewel of the Kalahari.
The truth about Magadi today is that it's still part of a vast inland system of channels draining rainwater from the surrounding Kalahari. What appear to be rivers filled only with sand flow with water after heavy rains. Where the ancient lake died, a shallow ghost of its former glory is resurrected. And, wraith-like, flamingos in thousands come seeking these ephemeral waters. This largest and most beautiful oasis in Africa is an accident of nature, as was the gigantic lake that once it fed. Magadi drained away, but Okavango flourished to become both refuge and a home. The buffaloes, elephants, zebras and wildebeest will turn again as new rains call them back to the interior. But Okavango will remain the jewel of the Kalahari.
The Natural World, tomorrow at 8:40 on BBC Two. In 50 minutes, the Film Club this week has an international double bill, beginning with Louis Buñuel's last film, That Obscure Object of Desire, which tells the story of a man obsessed with a woman who keeps changing her character. And then the second film at 11:45 is from director Paul Cox, Man of Flowers, hailed as one of the finest Australian films of the 80s, following the unusual and repressed life of Charles Bremer, a recluse unable to have a successful relationship with the opposite sex. The Film Club begins in 50 minutes. This is BBC Two, and now the story of the quest for the Greek trireme.
Off a tiny island in the Aegean, in the summer of 1987, a remarkable event took place. The genius of ancient Greece joined forces with modern English scholarship across a divide of 2,000 years. A 170 British oarsmen pulled in unison, and a wooden warship sailed out of the history books and into the 20th century. For the Greeks, it was an intensely proud moment, because this was a replica of the legendary trireme, the guided missile of its day. These ships, with their fearsome battering rams, had once allowed Greece to dominate the eastern Mediterranean, enabling her culture to flourish and to pave the way for Western democracy. But there was one person watching that day for whom the occasion had a very special meaning. The Englishman who had made it possible.
Well, there it is. It's fantastic. It's a dream I dreamed nearly 50 years ago. There it is, a reality.
It was in that green and pleasant land 1,500 miles away that it had all begun. Professor John Morrison, a classical scholar and naval historian, now lives in retirement near Cambridge. But he first dreamed his dream at the beginning of the Second World War, while waiting to go into the Navy. He was reading Plato's The Republic, and there was a line there which particularly caught his eye. It was an obscure reference to triremes, and it was to prove the starting point of a quest which would absorb him for most of his life.
There's a passage here in which Plato talks about the universe being tied together with ropes like the undergirdings of triremes. When I first read that, I hadn't the faintest idea what it meant. And when I looked up into commentaries, I found that they hadn't got any idea either. In fact, nobody seemed to have a satisfactory idea of how a trireme worked, ropes or oars or anything else. And this is extraordinary in view of the great historical importance of this vessel. So I got hooked on the idea of trying to find out.
The Greeks' crowning achievement with this ship was almost 5 centuries before Christ, the great trireme battle in which they defeated the invading Persians. Persia then had almost the whole of the eastern Mediterranean under its control, all but the Greek-held Peloponnese and Salamis. In the final stage of the crucial Salamis campaign, the Greeks had 300 triremes at Pelukia Bay. The Persians were at Piraeus, outnumbering them at least 2 to 1. The odds against them would have been even worse, but Themistocles, the Athenians' great trireme commander, had tricked the Persians into believing they were withdrawing. Xerxes, the Persian king, had dispatched half his fleet south to head them off. He now sent his remaining 2 squadrons to patrol the Narrows. His men had been at their oars for many hours when the Greek triremes suddenly appeared. They broke through the lines of Persian ships, and with their speed and tactical skill surrounded them. Although the Greeks suffered heavy losses in this bloody battle, the invading fleet was destroyed, and with it, Xerxes' ambition of the conquest of Greece. The Greeks had re-established their command of the seas. They, and later the Romans, went on to develop the larger quinquiremes. But eventually the last of these extraordinary warships disappeared. By the 5th century AD, the secrets of the Greeks' naval genius had been lost in the mists of time. It was still known that the trireme was so called because there were 3 files of oarsmen along either side of the ship. But when Morrison came on the scene, the accepted view was that they all sat at the same level. It was thought that only this could allow for the extra oarsmen in the later quinquireme, which had 5 files along either side. Morrison came to believe that this view was wrong, and by using an outrigger, the trireme had in fact been rowed by oarsmen at 3 levels. The quinquireme would then have involved adding an extra man to the 2 lower levels. Morrison's search for evidence was to lead him through the art and literature of the ancient world, for the clues were few and far between. Speculation about the vessel's oar system had been revived in the middle of the last century with the publication of a paper about a carving dating from the time of the trireme's supremacy. The carving had been discovered beside the Parthenon and was known as the Lenormant relief. For a while it had been thought that it showed part of a ship with 3 levels of oarsmen. But this had eventually been discounted. A major reason was that it led to the building of this, a massive folly rowed on 3 levels, commissioned by Napoleon III for the Paris exhibition. The thing had been a disaster and was eventually used for target practice and sunk. The idea of a 3-tiered Greek trireme seemed to have died with it. But Morrison decided that the original interpretation of the Lenormant relief had been correct just the same. And he found confirmation of the idea in the Talos vase at Ruvo in southern Italy. Part of its decoration was a heroic scene of which the background was the stern of a ship.
No one had ever noticed it before, but it was clearly a trireme. There were some huge figures which put everything out of proportion and also obscured some of the detail. But when one looked closely, one could see that there was an outrigger and 2 rows of portholes, one above the other. When I saw this, I was convinced that we were on the right track.
That vase illustration, with the figures removed, was to provide vital clues to the arrangement of the oars.
Another piece of evidence is provided by Aristophanes' play, The Frogs. It's rather rude. In fact, some people think it's too rude to be treated as serious evidence. The poet Aeschylus, is talking to the god Dionysus about the trireme oarsmen. He says all they think about is filling their stomachs. And Dionysus replies, yes, and making wind into the face of the other oarsmen. So it doesn't take much imagination to realize that one oarsman is sitting at a higher level than the other.
Other ships with 2 tiers of oarsmen were already well known, like this one pictured on a 6th century vase. A working model made by Morrison's father demonstrated that the addition of an extra file of oarsmen on an outrigger was at least feasible. It showed too that it was possible for each team of 3 men to use oars of the same length, which was also contrary to the accepted view. At first sight, the ancient naval lists which had been found at Piraeus seemed to challenge this, but in fact they supported it. They listed oars of 2 lengths, 9 and 9.5 cubits.
Aristotle explains this in a passage in the Parts of Animals. He compares the fingers of the hand to the oars of the trireme, the shorter at each end, the longer in the middle. And incidentally, when I got into the Navy, I found the same arrangement in the naval cutter, the shorter oars fore and aft. In the case of the trireme, you'll remember, the naval list showed that the oars were of 2 lengths. Aristotle's evidence must therefore mean that in each unit of 3 men, one uppermost, one middle, and one lowest oarsman, all the oars had to be of the same length, QED.
In an article in the Mariner's Mirror in 1941, Morrison set out his arguments for the trireme's 3-tiered oar system. But it was all still just a theory. It would be many years before he could prove it. Then, while researching a book in 1965, he uncovered further evidence. A gold coin from the end of the 4th century BC showed the bow and ram of a trireme. Clearly visible too was the projecting wooden shield designed to protect an outrigger. He also found a ceremonial stirrup cup, again 4th century, which filled in more of the detail. Besides the ram and that sinister eye, there were timbers to support the outriggers. The harbour at Zia in Piraeus provided final proof that a single rowing level was an impossibility. This had been a trireme base, where the ships were berthed in individual boat sheds. The foundations had already been measured, and some had been preserved in the cellar of a 6-story block of flats. At street level, the remains of some of the supporting pillars themselves can still be seen. On this evidence, the triremes couldn't have been more than 36 meters long, not long enough to fit in 85 oarsmen on each side if they were sitting on one level. But by using the oar system suggested by the Lenormand relief, Morrison was able to show that there was room if they sat in 3 tiers. An article in the Times in September 1975 sparked off the longest correspondence that paper has ever seen. The author, Eric Leach, raised the question of the trireme's sails, suggesting that the ship's success depended on them far more than Morrison and others believed. Morrison met the challenge, quoting an account of a particular voyage.
Sir, a trireme under oar covered 140 miles in a long day, i.e., if that is 12 hours, at nearly 12 knots. The Athenians of Pericles' day were outstandingly fine oarsmen and fine sailors. They were not so foolish as to take a first-class rowing machine designed for ramming into battle under sail.
Mr. Leach still didn't agree.
Sir, speeds of around 12 knots would only have been possible under sail. The trireme as a first-class rowing machine, contradiction in terms, was a non-starter, and the speed of about 1/2 of what Mr. Morrison believes to be true might have been achieved.
4 days later, K.A. Meads of the Vesta Rowing Club weighed in.
Sir, if indeed such a performance was possible, this club will be giving serious consideration to selling our existing racing fleet and converting to triremes.
As October arrived, C. St. J. Thomas suggested an explanation of the Greeks' extraordinary speeds.
Sir, the discovery by Miss Honor Frost of hashish in the Punic trireme, reported in the Times today, implies that the crew were high on the stuff and were stimulated to feats which by today's standards appear unbelievable.
Morrison spent the last 15 years of his career at Cambridge's University College, later renamed Wolfson. He retired as president in 1980 and began lecturing abroad. 2 years later, a banker named Frank Welsh arrived at Morrison's home. The meeting had been arranged after Welsh had suggested to a mutual friend at a dinner party that the theory should be put to the test. A trireme should be built. By this time, John Coates, a retired chief naval architect from the Ministry of Defence, was already working with Morrison on an idea for a book.
John, this is Frank Welsh. I think you know.
From this meeting emerged a plan for getting the project underway.
Is to build a full-size replica.
Welsh would act as manager, and with the fragments of evidence which Morrison had collected, and Coates' skills as a boat designer, plans for building a Greek trireme would be drawn up. But could a three-tiered ship actually be rowed? There was only one way to find out. They built a small section, erected it in the garden, and enlisted the help of youngsters from a local rowing club.
That's gone now. So, Russell, would you like to sit in the Thalamian place?
That's down at the bottom.
That's right, the one down at the bottom. And now, the two Zugian oarsmen.
And this middle one.
Up there. With your cushions.
I'm going to climb all the way up there.
Now, Ben, will you go up into the Threnite seat? It's the most difficult oar to row, but they were paid more, so that ought to encourage you. Try and pretend that there's some water there.
Just about is, isn't it?
Right. Good, that's fine.
Right, okay.
Now try and get the ends of the oars in line and start rowing.
Go. Gently. Up.
That's excellent. Because there's not much room between the oars.
It's difficult without the water as well.
The Threnite oars, of course, comes a little bit further out than the others because of the outrigger.
When we had made a satisfactory design, the next step was to find out how we could get it built. Our first idea was to try and get it built somewhere in this country where there was unemployment. And we were, in fact, negotiating with a shipyard on the Musee. John Coates, in the meantime, went out to Greece to see the reconstruction of the Kyrenia ship. This ship was built on the same method which we proposed to use for the trireme. But when he was there, he found that the Greeks were extremely interested in our project and wanted to build it there.
The Greeks, in fact, were hoping to host the Olympic Games in 1996. They clearly saw a trireme, they called them trieres, as a tangible and well-timed link with their past. The chief of the Hellenic Navy, Vice Admiral Leonidas Vassilikopoulos, put it like this.
We see it as part of our duty to retain our naval history and tradition. The treatise expresses to the world in the most authentic way possible the principles of Greece civilization. It provides a symbol for generations to come of freedom, of democracy, and of the classical spirit.
A wintry morning in Coventry, early in 1985. The weather may have been bleak, but spirits were high. The dream was at last becoming a reality. The Hellenic Navy had flown over Commander Stavros Platis, a naval architect, and a shipwright, Lieutenant Christos Leletsis. What they'd come to see was work in progress on a trial piece being built for the Trireme Trust by a Coventry cooperative.
Those are the mortises, yes.
And, well, how about the harmonia? Where are they?
Ah, well, here is a harmonia.
Yes.
See, made of green heart, very hard wood, and it fits tightly into the hole.
Yes, it fits perfectly all right.
The method of construction was based on discoveries about other ships of the period, thanks to recent developments in underwater archaeology. The plan was to test the trial piece in water and put it on show at the Henley Regatta. It would then be shipped out to Greece as a guide for the builders of the full-sized vessel. In May of the following year, John Morrison returned to Greece to visit the boatyard at Piraeus, where the replica itself was now being built. Frank Welsh had arrived earlier. So had the trial section. Now you could begin to sense the awesome power within that graceful hull, to imagine the lethal combination of wood and muscle. At this stage, the cost to the Hellenic Navy was going to be the equivalent of £350,000. The keel had been constructed of African Iroko. Oregon pine was being used for the hull.
I find it extraordinarily moving to look at this ship. What amazes me is that although it's an extremely practical machine, it's also extremely beautiful. The stern curving up into the roof of the ship shed really takes my breath away. I find it rather difficult to think of it as sort of my own idea, because it's been really something that's been recovered.
But today's boat builders are used to constructing the interior frame first. This involved building the ship's shell before that framework. And with only a handful of craftsmen on the project, things were moving slowly. 20,000 mortise and tenon joints were having to be made. The ship would depend on them to hold it together. Morrison was worried about whether they were really watertight.
It's terribly important that these joints should be absolutely tight, particularly the tenon inside should fit exactly and the water shouldn't get in. So we're having to draw the attention of the boat builders to this very frequently.
The problem will be greater as you go further up and the joints are flatter.
This is the water line here.
Yes,
more or less.
just about.
Just about.
Second
Still,
is coming in
this
now.
was the day on which the Greeks were to make the trireme official. Melina Mercouri, once a film star, now the Greek Minister of Culture, arrived to give the replica the seal of approval and to pay a tribute.
I believe that when we do common plans together with great people like Mr. Morrison, and we are working for a symbol like a tree is today, we can make great things. It's beautiful to collaborate the English wise men with the people of Greece.
A year later, March 1987, the planking was in place and the outriggers were being constructed. Those suspect joints had been reinforced through the injection of waterproof glue. But work had fallen seriously behind schedule, and more men had had to be brought in to speed things up. Instead of a year, she was taking 2 years to build. So the cost was mounting, a headache for the man in charge of the project, Commander Petit.
There are several reasons why this time has been extended 1 more year. And they are, of course, the first, I suppose, is the way that this ship is built, which is completely different than the way that the Greek boat builders have been used up to now. This shell-first method has caused to us a lot of trouble until we got to know it and to work with this very well. Another reason is the material. It has come from the United States, and it took some more months from those we have originally expected. The cost has been increased, I suppose, to something like 5% more than the contractual one. And the reason is that the man-hours have to be paid at a higher rate, and the cost of the materials has increased.
The main rail can be nailed independently onto the ends of the heads of the outrigger brackets.
John Coates, as official advisor, had been commuting regularly from his home in Bath. Today he'd arrived just in time to correct what could have been a costly mistake. The positions for some of the brackets for the aft outriggers had been wrongly marked and would have obstructed the upper oar ports.
Right, good.
Yes, Vangelis suggests that this nail should go at an angle through this bracket.
Yes?
Yes.
Into the gunwale.
Into the gunwale.
Quite right. It must be 8.
Okay, very good.
Because the braces of the outrigger will be thrusting outwards on the rail.
Problems there certainly were, and the language barrier didn't help. But overall, it was still proving to be a brilliantly successful realization of the original idea.
Now, the fascinating thing about this project is the way in which, on the basis of the evidence provided by John Morrison and by the Punic ship, there was a sort of inevitability about the design. As a boat designer, I found that when I came to fill in the gaps, there was time and time again only one solution. The one surprise was that of the shape of the stern, and for that I took, first of all, the shape of the Punic ship. But I found that it really would not work for the trireme. As a result, you see here a stern which sweeps down much more gently than the Punic ship.
By now, the trireme's 170 oars stood ready for action. But the manpower had yet to be tested.
Stavros, I'd like to show you a lower oarsman's place so that you can be fairly sure that the clearances are satisfactory. I think they've come out rather well. Let me climb in.
Yes, I'd like very much to see it, because we were a lot worried in the beginning concerning these clearances.
Yes, well, it's this sort of thing which determines the design to a large extent.
Yes, yes.
Now, here is the oar. I'm sitting on a seat which isn't really very well secured, and here is a foot stretcher supporting my feet. So, here we are. Now, I'll put the handle underneath the beam, because that is one of the important clearances.
Yes.
And there are about 60 centimeters, 60 millimeters. And here there is quite a considerable good clearance with the end of the handle with the pillar.
Yes.
And so I think that's going to be all right. And it will allow for some roll of the ship. Now, looking at the thole pin, you can see that when the oar is in this position, it's just clear of the oar port, and there is plenty of room for securing the watertight leather sleeve, which has to go round the oar to stop the water from coming in.
Yes, yes.
And that could be secured to the timbers of the ship inside the ship. Now I'll move the oar so that you can see a complete stroke. Now coming forward with the oar out of the water, starting the stroke, pull.
So the extreme position is there.
It wouldn't come as far as that,
Yes,
actually.
yes.
And then forward, and at that point, the oar is hitting the other end of the oar point.
Yes. It's quite satisfactory, I think.
In July, 220 of our best oarsmen, including nearly 50 women, flew out from Britain at their own expense to learn how to row this extraordinary vessel. Their destination, the island of Poros, where 2 weeks of trials were to take place.
All rowers on this side. Anybody in the barracks on this side. Yeah.
A couple did it the hard way, arriving after 23 days in the saddle on a sponsored cycle ride from Nottingham. They were greeted by their first taste of the strict security at the Petty Officers' School, where the crew were to be put up. Greece was still wilting at the end of the worst heat wave they'd seen for several decades. But the challenge the oarsmen had come to face was waiting at the quay, the Greeks' newest warship. Up till now, none of the visitors had tackled anything more ambitious than a racing 8. A little surprise to be there was a Hereford GP, Mike Budd.
9 days ago, I was suddenly given the job as rowing master because Boris Renkoff, who was to have done it, is ill in Australia. I found at first this was a very daunting task, but in a couple of days I formed a plan in my mind of how I was going to cope with it. Having never seen the boat, this wasn't very easy. Now we've just arrived, and I have seen the boat, and there she is, sitting on the water, and she's a magnificent sight, but it still worries me whether we are going to be able to row this in the very short time we have available, just 2 weeks. To get those 170 people all rowing together is going to be an extremely difficult coaching job.
I can't show you on this.
With no time to lose, they were soon sorting out the teams in which they'd be rowing, their positions marked in chalk on the quay.
And one person is the one what everybody on, the rest of our section takes the rating from.
6, 7, 8, 9. Well, I'd be 9, so that's 9.
The 9 people at the bottom are the people who's going to start.
Next morning, as the barracks clock struck 7, the British crew were on parade. But one person was notable by his absence. The Greek triarch or captain hadn't arrived, and Hellenic Navy protocol forbade anyone boarding until he was there. There were no exceptions. So, as the temperature began to rise, they all just had to wait. When Lieutenant Dimitris Papadas finally joined them at 8:30, there was still the formality of raising the flag before the visiting oarsmen could be allowed on board.
The oars need to be across.
The oars and they're in such a position as a safety precaution.
Yes.
So because if the wind picks up, of course, they're going to go all over the place. But after this first outing, we can leave them rigged for the afternoon hour. But every evening they'll have to be pulled back.
I have not had an opportunity to go on the boat to see exactly what it is like. You would like to move forward both sides and go on alternately, starboard and port, starboard and port, starboard and port. Move down to your position in the bow end and tread very carefully indeed on the woodwork. Don't step on anything that looks as if it'll break.
These ships had been the high technology of their time. Not surprising that the men who rowed them had not been slaves, as popular myth has it, but free men, hand-picked, highly skilled, and in the peak of condition.
You can row up a further rack into the back there, okay?
I went up to Oxford in 1974, and my drinking friends and myself, we formed a little club called the Trireme Club. We always imagined that we were going to go to the Aegean for some trireme races. That was 1974. And I never really thought that 13 years later I'd be sitting in this boat. It's fantastic.
Then, gingerly, they put to sea. It was a moment for which John Morrison had waited almost half a century.
I think it's absolutely incredible. Here we are with the Greek Triarch, a crew of British men and women at the oar, moving out from Palais under a light breeze into the waters of the Saronic Gulf. It's absolutely incredible. I never thought it would ever happen.
But this first outing was about to hit trouble. The ship had gone only a few meters when there was a nasty encounter with a buoy, the result of Lieutenant Papadass's odd decision to steer a course to windward of it.
Hard on stroke side, light on bow side, look down together.
Luckily, the only damage was a broken oar. But this mishap, on top of his late arrival, meant that from now on the Triarch would be Captain Pugwash to the lower decks.
Kaiser and some jam for tea, Brutus and a rat.
The rowing was pretty ragged to start with, but gradually the British crew began to get the hang of it, increasing the oar power in easy stages. Eventually, they got her up to all 170 oars rowing. Keeping a sharp eye on the ship's progress was the man who'd been with her from the drawing board on.
One of the problems is that the ship is a little light, by about 3 to 5 tons, and that causes the handles of the oars to be a little higher inboard than they should be, and there's some fouling with stretchers. She needs about 5 tons of ballast, but unfortunately that has not yet arrived. I've always been concerned about the strength of this design, which has a long, shallow wooden hull. It's put together by a method with which the boat builder was quite unfamiliar, and I don't think that he has succeeded in making the hull as stiff as it could be. This may partly explain why the ends of the ship have dropped by about 10 centimeters. Another cause could be that rope that Plato talked about, stretched from one end of the ship to the other under tension. I would very much like to increase that tension, but at the moment I dare not.
Why am I here? Because Captain Papathos suggested I should sit here, and I must say it's marvellous to look out over the ship. I can see it all working. But I do feel a bit above my station.
Training settled into a routine of early morning and late afternoon sessions. And suddenly this holiday island found it had the eyes of the world upon it. In their pale blue trireme T-shirts, the Brits were soon a familiar feature of the porous seafront. Timothy Shaw, one of our leading coxers and rowing coaches, kept himself fit for the taxing job of helmsman. The oarsmen made their way from the barracks to a local taverna for breakfast, and there was just one topic of conversation.
And I think we want to do a long run, but we'll have to do a long run at a very slightly reduced pressure. Yeah, I think.
No, he's ex-Navy.
Persian U-boats on the full bowser coming in for torpedo run. this reed periscopes.
The ancient Greeks used to talk about the wings of the trireme. You could see what they meant. But they were designed for men of about 5'6". Most of the modern oarsmen were just too big. And though the women had the advantage of size, they were at a disadvantage as far as muscle was concerned.
Well, we are. I mean, clearly it was rowed by Greek men, and it's the majority of people rowing here are men, so we just have to keep up with them. So it is quite a problem, especially for the smaller women in the boat, but it's still great fun.
It gets very, very hot down here, because obviously you're out of any breeze that gets through the boat. The other problem with rowing here is you can't actually see what you're doing, so it's all by feel. Very little room as well. It's very hard not to hit the guy in front of you in the back, so it can be quite tricky.
From backstops, 5, 10, 15. Get ready. Are you ready? Go. 1, out. 2, out. 3, out. 4, out. Next stroke. Burn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next stroke. Go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
With practice, they got up to 7 knots. But using lighter oars next year, they reckoned they'd do 9.
3, 2, 1. Easy. Go. Okay, we're going to do a turn trial now.
And it was her turning ability which amazed everyone. This was what had made the trireme such a deadly opponent, when the name of the game had been to outmaneuver the enemy, close on him amidships where he was most vulnerable, ram and withdraw.
Halfway around. In, out, 38. In, out,
She turned on a sixpence, 180 degrees in 2.5 lengths, and she did it in a fraction over a minute.
Oh, well, the boat is magnificent. She's rowable, and we've proved it. And this is an enormous credit to Professor Morrison and John Coates, the designer. They've got everything practically right, and it's absolutely amazing that we've been able to take 170 oarsmen, put them in that boat, and within a week, get them rowing as well as they are.
Between training sessions, there were breaks from the cramped and sweltering conditions on board, and the chance to catch up on the chores. For the organizers and their interpreter, conferences with the Trirock.
To the Trirock and say that that's what we would like to do, a whole day trip there. On the 13th, yes. And hopefully one full pressure on that day. And the other thing is that if it gets much hotter, would we be able to go out 1 hour earlier? That's right. Yes.
Το πρώτο πράγμα είναι, έγινε κάποια αναθεώρηση του προγράμματος.
The only clues to the trireme's sails had been what was known of other ships of the period. So this had been left to an expert on square-rigged sailing, Owen Roberts.
A major problem with this kind of design is that we have a row of oar ports which are low near to the water. For sailing, it isn't just a question of splashing water through these. The vessel will heel, and in order to prevent a steady pressure of water against these, we had to consider how much sail area this vessel could carry. We then designed this sail area then so that the vessel would heel no more than about 9 degrees in a 14-knot breeze. That is, the distance between the present waterline and those lower oar ports would only be halved. And in that way, we hope that we've solved that little problem.
Beaching the trireme involved an inflatable taking a line ashore while the bow anchor was dropped. With the oarsman rowing in reverse, she was then taken in stern first. With no facilities on board and the need for drying out the hulls, the old triremes, when away from base, spent a lot of time on the nearest beach. By now, the date for the commissioning ceremony at Piraeus had been changed, and only a handful of the Brits would be able to stay on. So most of the glory, perhaps rightly, would be going to a crew of Greek sailors. Those years of painstaking scholarship and the skills of the boat designer had proved a magnificent combination. It was a measure of their achievement that the basic rightness of their ship had been taken for granted almost from the first day. But then the moment came to say goodbye.
3 cheers for Mrs. Totes Morrison. Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip! Hooray! Hip hip!
Thank you very much indeed for your efforts on this first occasion.
The Greeks, too, now knew they had a potent symbol in their bid to host those 1996 Olympics.
The interest in it is amazing. Scholars, historians, naval officers, boat builders, athletic clubs, cultural institutions, all are fascinated by it. For the future, we want the ship to be used by oarsmen from all over the world and make it a means to international cooperation, peace, culture, and the Olympic ideal.
Well, John, it does look as if this trireme of ours really works. And I must admit that up to this moment, I never really believed that it could be pulled with precision and safety.
Well, for my part, I was convinced by the trial piece at Henley.
Yes, but a ship with 170 oars
Surely.
And 3 levels of oarsmen is rather a different cup of tea.
Yes, but we've seen how quickly this very good crew pulled together. It took them just about 2 days to do it, and then it was simply marvelous to see.
Well, what do you suppose our next trip is going to be? The Quinquereme?
Well, yes.
See you in Rome.
But before that, there was one small formality. Their Greek warship had to be commissioned into the Hellenic Navy. Melina Mercouri was there to do the honours. And as had been expected, the name she gave her was Olympias.
Drives a new Audi A8 because it's one of the few cars in the world made from fully galvanized steel. So, if Carl's skipper should get a little careless, rust won't be Carl's problem. Getting his guest home again could be. Vorsprung durch Technik.
This, of course, one of the great prizes in sport. The winning prize is about £270,000. The value reference point of the stallion is almost impossible to calculate. It's certainly into probably £10 million sterling if you actually wanted to sell him. But I'm certain that Lewis Friedman doesn't want to sell. He's already parted with a quarter share in advance, as you know, to Gordon White, the owner. But the man who must be most pleased of all is Henry Cecil, the winning trainer, who's now with Derry.
Yes, I would have thought sort of training the first two favourites in the Derby would have taken years off his life. You look remarkably relaxed.
Oh yeah, but I was quite relaxed before the race. I was very happy with the two horses. And I can only do, can do no more than get them there as I think right. And I was very happy with them. And if something went and beat them, then they're a better horse, and I wish I'd trained that.
You were very confident before the race about both horses running well.
I was actually. I was sort of slightly disappointed with the way the other horse ran actually. But reference point, he's a marvellous horse.
He really is, isn't he? He is some horse. But take us back 3 months ago when you had an operation.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very bad sinus operation, and I'm very lucky. I mean, I've got a marvellous staff, a marvellous head man with Petit, terrific work jockey in Frank Story, who rode him most of his work. Marvellous vet in Richard Greenwood, who's he's a friend of mine as well. And in fact, I trained for him. He's an owner, so I must like him.
You must. Look, if you come down, Henry, you can actually see the horse. He's just down there. He's just getting a wash down with his lads. Yeah. And there's the famous Derby-winning rug.
I can't get in there because I forgot my pass.
Oh, you forgot your pass?
This is the nearest I can get to it.
The winning trainer can't get in the stable. What's it like winning the Derby?
It's a lovely feeling, very relaxed feeling. You know, sort of almost sort of, you feel sort of half asleep, really.
Really?
Yeah.
What will you do now? How will you celebrate tonight?
I'm going to ring up my head man and his wife and the secretary and tell them to organise dinner. We don't do anything before the race, and it's a very bad sign. And we'll all go out to dinner and enjoy ourselves.
And you'll be back on the Gallops tomorrow morning?
Yes. Well, we got the Oaks on Saturday. So we'll keep going.
What about Scimitara? How is she?
Well, we're very pleased with her, but you know, you have one sort of excitement, and you go back home tomorrow. We've got to start all over again, don't we?
It's a lovely life, but you make it look easy. But many, many congratulations on a superb training performance, Henry.
Thank you very much.
Yes, what a training performance by all the team Warren Place. Well, it will be a derby I think people remember for a long, long time. What memories is Judith getting already?
Well, Bref, at least I got the third, so I don't feel quite so bad because I staked an awful lot of money on it today. Now, I'm only kidding, really. But I'm actually with two very glamorous people now, Dempsey and Makepeace, Glynis Barber and Michael Brandon, who, despite that series in America, in fact, both live in Britain. So how did you go on the derby? Michael, first of all.
I lost every race.
Oh, dear. Glynis, have you got a better story to tell?
Well, I won on the second race, but then I lost everything on the last one.
She won so good on the second, that's why I started betting the way she did, and then I lost everything.
You're in the series, Dempsey and Makepeace, which we see, and we're just rerunning again now, as a rather quality cop, and you're the hard-bitten New Yorker cop. You're not like that in real life, are you?
No, I'm not a cop.
He's a traffic warden, actually.
Have you been to much racing before now?
No, none whatsoever, actually. This is the first time. It's great fun, actually. I think this is a must from now on.
What do you like about it, Glynis?
Well, it's just nice, you know, having a little bet and getting all excited when you think it's going to win and then getting upset when it loses. It's better if you win.
So did you back Sir Gordon's horse because you came in his party?
No, I didn't. I should have. But just, you know, the odds were so bad because it was such a favourite that you had to put so much money. So I went for the second favourite because I liked the name, and it lost.
Oh,
I should have gone with the host.
And what about you, Michael? Are you going to make this sort of day out a regular pattern in your life now?
Oh, this is really pleasant. I love it out here. See, we weren't able to come before because of the schedule of the shooting of the series, and this is really wonderful. I mean, the weather, the whole style of it. I mean, this is something you just can't get in the States.
Well, we're delighted that you've joined us on the programme, and thank you very much, Glynis Barber and Michael Brandon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, and of course, if the day belongs to people who haven't been to races before, it's also the most important day ever for those who look after the horses. Alison Dare looks after Reference Point, as she looked after Home on the Range, his mother, and she's now down there, and Jim McGrath's having a word with her.
For the Derby winner, Reference Point, who's taken the race so well, he's actually walking around faster than Alison Dean, his stable girl, would actually like. Alison, it's been well publicised, his problems, but seriously, 3 months ago, did you really envisage him getting to the Derby?
Not quite, but we just really kept going, and everybody was really, really brilliant about it all.
And Alison, we've heard about tubes coming out of his head, etc. How bad was it? Did you actually sleep outside the box, etc., that sort of thing?
No, he was constant watched by vets, by the governor, by myself, by the head lad, everybody. I mean, it just seemed to be going on forever for a while.
And Alison, he seems to have taken it extraordinarily well. He's hardly turning a hair. He's not bothered about all these cameras or bits and pieces or all the kerfuffle. Is he always like this?
Yeah, he's a very good character. He's a complete gentleman. He probably thinks he deserves a pick of grass now.
And you've done some of his family before. Is he like them in any way?
Yes, his mother was very, well, she was very quiet, but very genuine, very, well, just very nice. You couldn't wish for better horses.
Well, Alison, you nicknamed him Herbie after the bubble car. You must think he's some sort of bubble car now.
He's a machine.
Alison, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.
You want him
Yeah. We have to. Well, I'm here. Whose horse is it anyway?